Sudan's capital Khartoum is now a war-torn battlefield. Once the home of 6 million people, now a constant barrage of artillery and airstrikes punctuate daily life. At least 3 million people have fled the city. Khartoum has become a ghost town. Even on Google Earth, you can see what were once busy, car-filled streets are now empty. War broke out in the capital on the 15th of April 2023 between the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, commanded by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the paramilitary group known as the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, commanded by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, widely known as Hemeti. This power struggle has caused the world's largest humanitarian catastrophe. International observers are sounding the alarm for genocide. 8.6 million people have been forced from their homes. 2 million have fled the country, many to neighbouring Chad and Egypt. This is the largest displaced population in the world. 25 million people, including 14 million children, are in need of immediate humanitarian aid. 18 million are facing severe hunger, the equivalent of the entire population of the Netherlands. 755,000 people are in famine conditions, meaning Sudan has now passed Gaza as the worst famine on earth. 2.5 million people are set to starve by September. The strange thing is that all this started out as an inspiring story of success. In 2019, a massive, peaceful, democratic revolution ousted former Sudanese dictator Omar al-Bashir after 30 years of repressive rule. Sudanese men and women went into the streets and demanded their rights and won. Then, 2 generals smothered Sudan's democratic revolution and have now turned on each other. A civil war has broken out in Sudan. Famine is looming, a genocide is underway in Darfur, all while the international community turns a blind eye or is directly profiting from the conflict. Sudan is collapsing, and here's why.
30 years of iron-fisted rule under Omar al-Bashir ended today.
Sudan is home to about 48 million people and around 500 different ethnic groups. It is 97% Sunni Muslim and Arabic is the main language. About 70% of the population are Sudanese Arabs, with significant minorities like Fur, Zaghawa and Masalit people. Sudan's history is thousands of years long, but we'll be starting in 1899 when this area was conquered by the British Empire, who then ruled Sudan as a colony until 1956. After independence, this new, massive Sudan faced huge challenges. The colonial borders the British drew forced very different peoples into one state. There was a divide between the country's wealthier Arab Muslim north and the less developed non-Arab Christian or animist south, which caused decades of civil wars, ending with Sudan splitting into 2 states when South Sudan broke off in 2011. In 1989, the military officer Omar al-Bashir seized power in a coup. Backed by the Sudanese Armed Forces, he ruled for the next 30 years. Since independence, Arab elites and military men in the Nile River Valley have dominated the Sudanese state, prioritizing development in cities like Khartoum while neglecting peripheral regions like Blue Nile, South Kordofan and Darfur. Subsidies for fuel and wheat for the cities are financed by exporting livestock, gum arabic, oil and gold from these peripheral regions. This system has left areas like Darfur, home to 11 million people and roughly the size of Spain, incredibly poor. Darfur was for centuries a wealthy Islamic sultanate until it was conquered by the British in 1916. Its unique identity predates the creation of Sudan, and the Arab elite centre has exploited and looked down on the African and Arab populations in Darfur. Darfur's history is multi-ethnic and identity there is very mixed, but generally in Darfur, Arab refers to Arabized indigenous Africans who live as nomadic camel or cattle herders. African generally applies to farmers. Both groups are black and Muslim and have intermarried for centuries. In the 90s, one Darfuri said, "We didn't think who is an Arab and who is a Masalit. We just thought that we were the same people." From the 80s onward, drought and desertification in Chad and Darfur forced nomadic Arabs to seek new water and grazing areas. causing conflict with settled farmers. Both sides correctly felt that the state was neglecting them. In 2001, Zagawa, Fur and Masalit rebel groups, unhappy with Bashir's rule and Darfur's neglect, launched a rebellion. By 2003, they were seizing towns and humiliating the Sudanese army, who were already busy fighting another civil war in the south. Omar al-Bashir's regime needed Darfur's resources. The rebels mostly recruited from the non-Arab population of Darfur, so al-Bashir targeted those groups with extreme violence. Al-Bashir needed an alternative to his struggling military, so he reinforced the ethnic lines of the conflict by paying and arming Darfuri Arabs. In return for steady employment, these men, armed with invaluable local knowledge, formed rapid horse-riding militias. These brutally effective fighters became known as the Janjaweed, or the Devils on Horseback. The Janjaweed systematically attacked non-Arab communities, primarily the Masalit, Fur and Zagawa, but also some of the non-involved Arab communities. While claiming that they were fighting rebels, the Janjaweed burned down entire villages. They systematically killed men and boys, they targeted women for rape, and they forced 3 million people from their homes.
Sudan's vast refugee camps are swelling once more and its death toll is rising.
Many ended up in camps for internally displaced persons or IDPs around cities such as Nyala, El Fasher and El Janina. By 2007, al-Bashir and the Janjaweed killed at least 300,000 people. In 2009, al-Bashir was indicted by the International Criminal Court for genocide in Darfur, but neither he nor the Janjaweed ever faced punishment for their crimes. After decades of repressive rule, al-Bashir needed to coup-proof his regime. The Sudanese armed forces had overthrown the government 3 times since 1956. To avoid this fate, he built a paramilitary to counterbalance the SAF. In 2013, he consolidated the Janjaweed militias into a single force under his direct control called the Rapid Support Forces. This new, highly mobile force could rapidly deploy to suppress any resistance to al-Bashir. Since 2013, the RSF has continued the Janjaweed's crimes in Darfur, destroying hundreds of villages with impunity. Hemeti is an Arab from Darfur, and he fought in the Darfur conflict and rose up to become a senior Janjaweed leader. He displayed exceptional loyalty to al-Bashir, who made him the leader of the RSF. The RSF crushed any resistance to an increasingly hated al-Bashir so efficiently that al-Bashir called Hemeti my protector. Hemeti had larger ambitions though. Sudan is the 3rd largest producer of gold in Africa, the world's most gold-rich continent. At the same time, Sudan remains one of the poorest countries in the world because the gold mined by the hard work of the Sudanese people has never enriched the Sudanese people, but it did enrich Hemeti. In November of 2017, Hemeti's RSF seized the Jebel Amir gold mines in Darfur from anti-al-Bashir rebels. Hemeti now controlled gold mines worth billions of dollars. 99% of Sudan's gold is exported to the United Arab Emirates or UAE, who refine it and then sell it on the international market, making the Emirates and Hemeti filthy rich. The Al Gunade company, run by Hemeti's family, has become a vast conglomerate covering gold, transport and construction. But the UAE and Hemeti's relationship went well beyond just gold. In 2015, the UAE struck a deal with Hemeti to send RSF soldiers to fight in the Saudi Emirati war on the Houthis in Yemen. The RSF mercenaries were paid $13,000 for each 6 months of fighting. A Sudanese doctor working overtime might earn about $500 a month. For impoverished Darfuris, fighting in the RSF became one of the only reliable sources of income. By 2017, there were as many as 40,000 RSF troops in Yemen. 20 to 40% of them were between the ages of 14 and 17 years old. This was a great deal for everyone. The UAE and the Saudis got to kill Yemenis without actually fighting, Hemeti got rich, and impoverished Darfuri 16-year-olds died fighting equally young Yemenis. The Saudi and the United Arab Emirates' ongoing war on Yemen has killed about 400,000 people. By late 2018, Hemeti was one of the richest men in Africa. He had built up an independent, battle-hardened military force of over 100,000 men. and 10,000 armed trucks alongside alliances in the rich Gulf states. This wasn't just a paramilitary anymore, it was a private army and business empire, a state within a state, and Hemedti had built his power base just in time. During an economic crisis in 2018, al-Bashir cut wheat and fuel subsidies, which tripled food prices. In December 2018, protests sprang up around the country demanding food security for all citizens. It quickly turned into a nationwide uprising against al-Bashir's 30 long years of oppressive rule. The whole country is Darfur became a slogan repeated over and over again in protests across Sudan, a show of solidarity for Darfur, whose suffering had been ignored for decades. This revolution was being led by groups called resistance committees, grassroots, civilian-led groups that organised neighbourhoods to wage civil disobedience campaigns against the government. Dozens of protesters were gunned down by the state, but thousands of young women and men in the resistance committees kept making their demands. The resignation of al-Bashir, the end of military rule, a transition to democratic civilian government, and the prosecution of war criminals, including al-Bashir. On the 6th of April 2019, the protesters gathered outside the military headquarters and presidential palace in Khartoum to build a protest encampment. Images of the protester Ala Salah leading chants went viral. Trade unions and resistance committees brought the country to a standstill. The noose was tightening around Bashir. Hemedti, Bashir's protector, joined with the military in a coup, and on the 11th of April 2019, the military placed al-Bashir under house arrest, ending 3 decades of his rule. The Sudanese revolution was a sudden success story. A democratic movement by the people ousted one of the world's worst dictators. The problem was that the military took over. The new government would be a transitional military council led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who took over as de facto head of state, with Hemedti as his deputy. The protesters refused to leave the streets. They demanded the RSF be dissolved, the army go back to the barracks, and the government be handed over to civilians. For the military and the RSF, this threatened their power and business interests. Al-Bashir was disposable, but the system wasn't. Al-Burhan and Hemedti began to crack down on the protests. In the early morning on the 3rd of June 2019, the RSF entered the protest encampment in Khartoum, surrounding the sleeping protesters.
What was planned as a night of culture and conversation became one of bloodshed and terror.
Chaos has broken out at the sit-in. I'm told that earlier rapid support forces and paramilitary group, now part of the armed forces, fired live ammunition up, beat them severely.
These people, we don't know if they were the RSF or not, entered Nile Street to try and clear the barricades. They fired live ammunition and there were loads of casualties. I saw 5 dead in front of me and transferred no less than 30 to hospital.
They unleashed a massacre. They burned people alive in tents and murdered and raped their way through the campsite. At least 130 protesters were killed, bringing the peaceful sit-in to a brutal end after 58 days. Eyewitnesses said the RSF fighters yelled, "You used to chant the whole country is Darfur, now we have brought Darfur to you." The democratic movement did not give in though. They remained in the streets. Negotiations led to a power-sharing agreement with a transitional government with al-Burhan as Sudan's de facto head of state, Hemedti as his deputy, and the civilians were represented by Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok. For months and months, civilian groups tried to negotiate a transition from military rule to full civilian rule, with a new constitution and elections in 2022. The problem was that the democratic transition was doomed from the beginning. In order for Sudan to become a democracy, it would have to separate the military from control of the economy and the state, which the military and Hemedti were obviously against. The trouble was that the military and Hemeti were the people with guns. The Sudanese people also wanted war criminals brought to justice. If they gave up their power, the generals would end up in court for their crimes in Darfur or the June 3rd massacre. And finally, the civilians wanted the RSF gone. Sick of negotiating with civilians, Al-Burhan and Hemeti teamed up on the 25th of October 2021 to perform a military coup. They dissolved the civilian part of the government and arrested Hamdok. The coup wasn't received well. Protests erupted across the country and were violently put down week after week. But the protests did continuously push Al-Burhan and Hemeti back to the negotiating table, as both wanted some sort of agreement with the civilians to legitimize their rule, but they wanted an agreement that left only them with the power and the guns. Negotiations after the October coup continuously froze over one issue: how to integrate the RSF into the Sudanese military. A country can't have two armies. Al-Burhan wanted the RSF to merge into the SAF within 2 years. Hemeti wanted a decade. From Hemeti's point of view, why would he give up his powerful paramilitary? The moment he does, he loses all leverage, and then Al-Burhan can eliminate him. If you're Al-Burhan, your incentive is to eliminate Hemeti as soon as possible. The longer you wait, the more powerful he gets. They smothered Sudan's potential democracy together, but now the two generals, one a brutal paramilitary leader from Sudan's most marginalized area, the other a career general representing the ruling class at Sudan's center, now faced off as it became clear that if they could eliminate the other, they could win the whole country for themselves. On the 15th of April 2023, the RSF launched a series of simultaneous attacks on SAF bases, on Al-Burhan's residence, and areas around Khartoum International Airport. The RSF also hit Meroe, Al-Obeida, Nyala, El Fasher and Port Sudan. At least 35 people died in the attempt to kill Al-Burhan at his residence. Al-Burhan himself survived. A civil war had begun. Khartoum became a deadly battle zone. People who could afford to fled the city. Millions of others faced daily airstrikes and gun battles as they sheltered in their homes. Hemeti's quick-moving and battle-hardened RSF established control over almost half the country, including Khartoum, forcing Al-Burhan and his generals to flee to Port Sudan. The SAF continues to use its main advantage, its air force, to bomb civilian areas indiscriminately, frequently slaughtering women and children. Both sides are constantly fighting for control of the area around Khartoum, but Darfur has seen the worst violence. Soon after the fighting broke out in Khartoum, the RSF attacked El Geneina, home to 540,000 people, what was once the lively capital of West Darfur. From mid-April to mid-June 2023, RSF forces with heavy artillery and gunfire systematically attacked civilians and infrastructure such as hospitals, mosques and schools in El Geneina. They targeted the primarily Masalit majority neighbourhoods in El Geneina and the internally displaced persons camps surrounding the city. In El Geneina, the RSF committed a campaign of systematic rape and enslavement of women in the areas they attacked. In and around El Geneina, the RSF went from house to house, killing Masalit or presumed Masalit males of any age.
We met one of the most senior Masalit figures from the region.
100% this is a genocide.
Can you put your hands up if either your father or your brother is either dead or missing?
The siege of El Geneina and the massacre killed between 10 and 15,000 people and created 370,000 refugees. You can see the destruction yourself on Google Earth. The Sudanese armed forces did next to nothing to protect El Geneina and its civilians. On the 14th of June, Kamas Abakar, the Masalit governor of West Darfur, was sheltering in a UNICEF compound. In an interview with Al Hadat TV, soon after the interview, the governor was captured by the RSF, and hours later, videos of his corpse were shared on Twitter. Abakar's killing triggered a panicked exodus out of El Geneina. On the night of the 14th of June, tens of thousands of refugees poured out of the city to make the 30-kilometer trek through the desert to Chad or to the SAF base in Ardamata a few kilometers north. The kilometers-long convoy leading to Ardamata was attacked by the RSF at sunrise on the 15th of June. The RSF opened fire on the convoy, massacring the refugees. The RSF forces shot at hundreds of women, men and children who tried to escape by swimming across the rapid Kaja River. 1,000 people were killed during this exodus. Many people from El Janina were killed at RSF checkpoints in the city and on the roads. Women disguised their male children in girls' clothes as they tried to escape El Janina. RSF fighters stopped women with children, checked the child's sex, and if it was male, they killed the child. By the 27th of July, 179,000 new refugees arrived in Adre, a poor border town in Chad. 600,000 Sudanese people are now living as refugees in Chad with little hope of returning home. The RSF are the Janjaweed relabeled. They avoided justice and the international community allowed them to flourish. Now they have 20 more years of experience and upgraded weaponry and are committing genocide again. The RSF has conquered the capital of all 5 Darfur states with the exception of Al-Fasher, a city that now stands alone. Its population has ballooned to 1.8 million people, as it houses over 1 million displaced Darfuris. Al-Fasher has been under siege by the RSF since April 2024. The RSF has blocked all roads leading to Al-Fasher. No one is coming to their aid, and the city is being starved to death. Both the RSF and the SAF block aid access to each other's territory. The Sudanese Armed Forces ordered international aid organisations and the UN not to deliver aid over the Chad border into RSF territory, and the organisations are obeying that order, which means that those under attack in Darfur are alone. In December 2023, the RSF captured Gezira State, Sudan's breadbasket that produces nearly half of the country's wheat. In that state alone, the RSF has looted supplies that could feed millions. Now, 18 million Sudanese are facing acute food insecurity. If the situation does not change, 2.5 million people could die by the end of September. Access in Sudan is so limited that we have no idea how many people have actually died in this war so far. The UN reports that about 14,790 people have died, but we know that around 15,000 people died in El Janina alone. Some experts believe that 150,000 people may already be dead. The Sudanese have been left to fend for themselves in the world's worst humanitarian crisis. To fight this crisis, Sudanese youth established emergency response rooms, or ERRs, across the country. Born from the resistance committees that led the 2019 revolution, ERR volunteers have evacuated tens of thousands from conflict zones, provided clean water and medicine, and kept the few hospitals still running stocked with fuel and supplies. They maintain water and communication infrastructure and run community kitchens that feed millions. But now, over a year into the war, it's getting harder with no aid coming in. And they're doing all this while both sides of the conflict are targeting them.
You stayed here throughout the war. Were you not afraid?
No, I'm not afraid. Afraid of what?
Afraid of being killed?
Man will kill, will die once, no? Not twice, once.
These emergency response rooms have been keeping Sudan alive by not only saving people, but by keeping the social fabric of Sudan from tearing apart. One ERR volunteer said, "Everybody should be able to eat and not feel shame. We, as Sudanese, are still helping each other. We survive together." The Rapid Support Forces have been winning on almost every front throughout the war, until January 2024, when Iranian-made armed drones helped the SAF halt the progress of the Rapid Support Forces. Iran wants an ally in Africa and on the Red Sea, and has found one in Al Burhan. The drones help pinpoint artillery strikes, which forces the RSF to flee from many areas and allowed the army to deploy forces on the ground. This has allowed the SAF to regain pockets of territory around Khartoum. Whether this actually changes the war or whether it just drags this hell out for civilians is yet to be seen. For years, the Wagner Group, Russia's state-funded private military company, has armed and assisted the RSF in exchange for access to Sudan's gold. Sudan's gold helps Russia avoid the effects of the economic sanctions placed on it after it invaded Ukraine in 2022. Gold is a global hard currency that Russia can use to prop up the ruble. Hemeti was in Moscow with a plane full of gold on the day Russia invaded. On the 5th of June 2019, 2 days after the RSF massacred over 100 protesters in Khartoum, the Wagner-affiliated company Mero Gold, a company with mines in Sudan, supported by the RSF, imported 13 tons of riot shields, helmets and batons to a company owned by Hemeti's family. Shortly after that, Hemeti purchased high-end surveillance and phone hacking equipment from Israeli intelligence, which allows him to crack down on any resistance in Khartoum or near his gold mines. In April 2023, the Wagner Group supplied the RSF with surface-to-air missiles, which have been invaluable in taking out SAF jets. After Wagner's leader died after a short-lived rebellion against Putin, it appears Russia has changed sides, or at least is now supporting both sides. In April 2024, Russia pledged recognition and military support and then began selling gas to Al-Burhan and the SAF. And Al-Burhan has committed to building a Russian naval base in Port Sudan. But the major player in Sudan's civil war is the United Arab Emirates, who have been using their vast wealth to influence regional politics. The UAE is a rich petrostate and key American ally in the region alongside Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and it hosts about 5,000 American military personnel. Hemeti keeps the gold flowing out of Sudan and into Dubai. Both Hemeti and the UAE and their customers want that gold to keep flowing. In June of 2023, Chad's president met with the UAE's president in Abu Dhabi, and Chad's president left that meeting with $1.5 billion. By the way, Chad's annual GDP is $12 billion. Suddenly, UAE cargo planes began landing in Andajaras, a tiny oasis town close to Chad's border with Sudan. Cargo planes from the Emirates have been landing there on a near daily basis since June 2023. When the records of these flights were publicly leaked, the UAE said that they had just built a 50-bed hospital there to help with the Sudanese refugee crisis, a crisis that's happening 300 kilometers to the south. The UAE called this a new milestone in the UAE's bright record of giving. What was it giving? Well, it wasn't aid. Locals have stated that the hospital is treating wounded RSF fighters. Weapons are flown into this airstrip and then are driven to Zarug, the main RSF base in North Darfur. Hemeti's fighters have used Emirates-supplied anti-tank missiles to target army bases in Khartoum. In February of 2024, a leaked document confirmed that 100 RSF soldiers were flown to the UAE for training on drones and tanks. The UAE, due to its support and arming of the RSF, is complicit in the genocide in Darfur, and any of its allies such as Saudi Arabia and the US who continue to support it are also complicit. The UAE sees Sudan as a useful Red Sea ally and also as a future cheap source of food and mercenaries. The Emirates have also positioned themselves as fighters against Islamism, which they think has influence over the SAF. During the 2011 Arab Spring, the fear of Islamism became a useful tool for Middle Eastern dictators as a way to brutally put down protests against their rule. Sure, they weren't killing democratic protesters, they were fighting Islamists. Promises to fight Islamists have for decades been used to gain Western military aid and immunity for human rights violations. Abdullahi Haleki from Refugees International said the UAE has worked more than any other country to stifle the emergence of democracy in the region. Hemeti has noticed that by calling himself a fighter against Islamism, he can win support from the West and Gulf states. He's even paid several Western PR firms millions of dollars to market him that way. One British PR firm Hemeti hired stated, "Just 7 months after the June 3rd massacre, the media tends to focus on the past, when his role in the current and future is more important. We should therefore seek to rebalance the perception of the military to neutral to positive." The past being mass murder, and not like some old dodgy tweets. Very few international powers actually want democracy to take hold in Sudan. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Russia and their allies know that a military regime would suit their interests. They want to keep resources flowing out of Sudan. They want bases in Sudan. And they definitely don't want an example of people overthrowing an authoritarian government. The question for them isn't how to stop civilian suffering, it's whether they prefer an SAF or an RSF military dictatorship. The war has devastated Sudan. The imperative now is to stop the fighting, deliver much needed aid and medicine, and end the ethnic cleansing in Darfur. Millions are starving. Millions have lost their homes. The RSF is carrying out a genocide. The SAF is indiscriminately bombing civilians from the air, while trying to maintain al-Bashir's old regime. Hemeti is the creation of decades of policies of Sudan's rulers in Khartoum. He has weaponized the marginalization and impoverishment of Darfur and placed it right at the center of Sudan's future. This is a war waged by two generals, a ruling class, and foreign powers against civilians in order to control the country's wealth, and innocent people are the ones paying the price.